This house was buried in records, and something inside wanted to be remembered. Wicker Hollow, New England, autumn 1812. The fog came early that year. It crept low across the dying fields of Wicker Hollow, curling like fingers through bare trees, veiling the land in ghostly silence. In the distance, a lone manor stood, a crumbling stone estate known only as Blackthorn House. Locals whispered its name with unease. The house had been abandoned for over 30 years, ever since the Elcott family vanished without explanation in the winter of 1779. Not a soul had been inside since, at least none who ever returned. But in the autumn of 1812, a man named Jonathan Harrow, a London-born historian and widower, arrived in Wicker Hollow with a letter of claim and a fascination for lost stories. He intended to restore the house and uncover the truth behind the Elcotts. "There is history here," he had written in his journal. "It speaks from the walls, beckoning." The townsfolk warned him. "Leave it be, sir," an old woman at the tavern had whispered, her eyes sunken with something beyond age. "That house don't keep company for long. You'll hear them in the walls, the ones who still walk." Jonathan smiled politely. He didn't believe in ghost stories. Not then. On the first night, Jonathan stepped through the great arched door of Blackthorn House with a lantern and a trunk of books. The air was sharp and still, the scent of mold and decay filling his lungs. Every footstep echoed like a breath from the earth itself. The furniture was intact, though dust-covered, almost like someone had left in haste but never packed. A broken tea set sat in the drawing room. A child's toy horse lay sideways on the floor. Upstairs, portraits still hung, faces faded and scratched, as if clawed. He chose the master bedroom for himself, laying his journal beside the bed. That night he heard a thud from the hallway, then silence. He opened the door. Nothing, only the cold, and a faint scent of lavender, fresh. He turned to go back to bed. That's when he noticed something carved into the wall beside the door that hadn't been there earlier. 4 words, scratched deep. "She never left here." October 2nd, 1812, the second night. Jonathan Harrow sat motionless at the edge of the bed, his breath suspended as he stared at the words carved beside his door. "She never left here." He ran his fingers across the etching. The wood was freshly marked, splinters still hung like wounds. No mold, no dust, recent, and yet he had locked the front door upon arrival. No signs of forced entry, no footprints on the floor. But he had seen nothing. He chalked it up to a prank. Perhaps a local boy with a dark sense of humor had snuck in earlier. He fetched a small cloth, dipped it in water from his wash basin, and began scrubbing at the carving. It didn't fade. The letters weren't just on the wood. They were in it, as if they had grown there. Later that evening, the house was deathly quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Jonathan sat by the fireplace in the study, leafing through old documents he had found in a locked drawer of the writing desk. Among them was a letter dated 1778, addressed to Thomas Elcott, the former master of the house. "The dreams have returned. She walks the corridor again. I hear her voice beneath the floor. Thomas, we must leave at once. The child speaks to someone we cannot see." See. The ink had smeared at the bottom, like tears had stained the page. Jonathan's fingers trembled as he flipped to the next paper. It was a drawing, made by a child. Crude, scratched in graphite. A house with no windows. A stick figure stood outside, but inside the house were 3 dark shapes, their eyes hollow. The word "Mama" was written repeatedly in the background. Then came the sound again. Not from the hall this time, from beneath the floorboards. It was faint, like a child's giggle. Jonathan dropped the paper. The fire cracked, and for a moment the flame dimmed blue, casting shadows that danced unnaturally long across the walls. Then came a soft knock from inside the wardrobe. October 2nd, 1812, midnight. Jonathan rose from his chair slowly, every nerve in his spine pulling tight. The knock from the wardrobe came again, 3 slow taps, then silence. The wardrobe was old, carved oak, its surface warped with time. He had glanced at it earlier in the evening, noting its size, but hadn't opened it. Now it loomed in the corner of the study like a waiting coffin. He approached with the lantern raised. "Is someone in there?" he asked. No reply. Only the creak of wood as if something shifted inside. He reached for the handle, hesitated, then pulled it open. Nothing. Only moth-bitten coats and a rotting wool shawl hung limply inside. No floorboard inside looked disturbed. But as he turned to shut the doors, he caught something. A small handprint, barely larger than a child's, pressed into the back wall of the wardrobe. But it wasn't painted. It was burned into the wood. Later that night, Jonathan moved the wardrobe aside and began knocking along the wall. Hollow. He fetched a chisel and small hammer from his satchel and began to peel away at the paneling. Beneath the surface, behind the wall, he uncovered a narrow wooden door, no larger than a cupboard. It groaned as he opened it. A tight, spiraling staircase of stone descended into blackness. There had been no mention of a cellar in any records he had reviewed. The original blueprints for Blackthorn House included no sublevels. Still, he lit a second lantern and began to descend. The air was colder here, older, a smell of damp stone, mildew, and something else, iron. The stairs ended in a bricked chamber. Against the far wall stood a cradle, old, splintered, empty. Etched into the stone behind it were more words, these ones scratched frantically, "Don't feed her after dark." As he turned to leave, he saw it, a faint shimmer behind the cradle, a mirror half broken, its frame decayed, but in its reflection, a woman stood behind him. October 3rd, 1812. Just after midnight, Jonathan spun around with the lantern raised, but the cellar was empty. Nothing behind him. No woman. Only the cracked cradle, the stone walls, and the echo of his own breathing. But in the mirror, the figure had been clear. A woman in black, pale, motionless, her eyes hollow, mouth sewn shut. Jonathan gripped the lantern tightly and backed away from the mirror. It had to be a trick. A hallucination caused by dust, exhaustion, shadows, anything but real. Still, he couldn't bring himself to touch the mirror. He turned and hurried back up the winding stairs, sealing the cellar door behind him. In his room that night, sleep didn't come. The fire refused to stay lit. Jonathan sat at the edge of the bed, clutching his journal, trying to convince himself what he saw was a product of stress. He began to write. Saw something in the cellar mirror. A woman. No record of any female figure dying on the property, but someone, something, is down there. I must be imagining this. Just as he finished the last word, a knock came from the window beside him. He turned sharply. Outside, thick fog. Nothing visible, no shape, no silhouette. But then, another knock, this time louder, like fingernails. He stepped to the window and wiped the condensation away with his sleeve. Still no one. But on the glass, written in the fog by an unseen finger, "You opened her door." At dawn. Jonathan walked into the village to question the locals. Most refused to speak to him. Others shut their windows when they saw him coming. Only the old woman from the tavern would look him in the eye. "You went inside, didn't you?" she rasped. "You opened the cellar. I can smell it on you." Jonathan tried to stay calm. What happened in that house? Who was the Elcott's daughter? The old woman's lip trembled. "There weren't supposed to be any children," she whispered. "They were warned. No child born under a blood moon survives in Wicker Hollow." She leaned closer. "But theirs did, and she never left." October 3rd, 1812. Afternoon. The rain began just as Jonathan returned to Blackthorn House. It came in thin sheets, icy and persistent, turning the road into sludge. The sky stayed dark even at noon, as if the sun itself refused to look upon the manor. He entered through the front door, soaked and silent, but the moment he stepped into the hallway, he froze. Footprints, small, wet, bare, leading from the front door. Up the stairs, he hadn't seen a soul on the walk back. No one had followed him, and these prints were too small for an adult, too light for boots. He followed them, lantern raised again despite the daylight. Every creak of the steps echoed in his chest. Upstairs, the footprints ended at the nursery door. He hadn't noticed it before. The door had blended into the wall, painted the same dull gray, but now it stood slightly ajar, as though just used. He pushed it open slowly. Inside, a rocking chair, a cracked window, a child's mobile hanging by a single string, spinning with no wind. And on the wall, in faded red crayon, were drawings, hundreds of them, layered on top of one another. Figures, all faceless, all with black circles for eyes. But what struck Jonathan most wasn't the drawings. It was the music box, sitting on the windowsill. It was open, and playing, softly. A lullaby he didn't recognize. He approached it cautiously, wind blowing through the cracked pane. Inside the box, there was no figure. But there was a tooth. Small, human. The final note of the lullaby. As the last note chimed, the mobile stopped spinning, the rocking chair ceased its sway, and in the corner of the room, where shadow met floorboards, a figure stood, low to the ground, head tilted, watching. "Mama says you don't belong here," a child's voice whispered. Then it was gone. October 3rd, 1812. Evening. Jonathan didn't remember leaving the nursery. His hands were shaking, his breath shallow. By the time he realized where he was back in the study, standing in front of the mirror he had uncovered in the cellar, now somehow moved to the fireplace mantel. He hadn't brought it up. He hadn't touched it. But there it stood, cracked and ancient, its reflection slightly slower than his own movements, lagging behind like a memory trying to catch up. He covered it with a blanket and poured himself a drink. Later that night, he returned to the journal, scrawling fast. "She is not a ghost in the traditional sense. She is attached to this place. A child, but not a child. The mirror should not have moved on its own. Either I'm losing my mind, or something in this house is alive." A creak interrupted his thoughts, not above or below, but inside the wall behind the bookshelf. He pulled the shelf away and found nothing, except a small door, no more than 2 feet tall. It looked like a crawl space, maybe once used by servants. He crawled inside, lantern between his teeth. The tunnel was narrow, dust thick, cobwebs brushing his cheeks. Then something scraped his hand. He looked down. It was a locket, stuck between the floorboards. Inside the locket, a sketch of a child, no older than 6. Her name was engraved in fine cursive. Clara Elcott, 1777. But opposite her picture, tucked behind glass, was a bundle of hair, still glossy. Suddenly, from within the tunnel behind him, a voice, soft, right next to his ear. "That's mine." He scrambled backward, hitting his head on the wooden frame. The lantern flickered wildly. For a split second, he saw her. Clara, face pale, mouth sewn shut, eyes black like ink. Her head tilted, not with curiosity, but hunger. Back in the study, Jonathan slammed the crawl space shut and dragged a chair in front of it. The locket sian, till in his hand he noticed the hair inside had begun to curl upward, like it was moving, reaching. He dropped it into the fireplace. But before the flames could consume it, the fire snuffed out. October 4th, 1812. Before sunrise, the fire remained cold. No matter how much kindling Jonathan added, the hearth refused to ignite again, as if something unseen now occupied that space, feeding on the warmth itself. He wrapped himself in his coat and lit every candle he could find in the house. Shadows stretched across the room unnaturally, twisting like vines along the walls. And then, from somewhere on the second floor, came the sound of something being dragged, slowly, scraping, heavy. He stood frozen in place, staring up the stairwell. The sound didn't repeat, but the silence afterward was somehow worse, taunting, expectant. The Hall of Portraits. Later that morning, Jonathan searched the second floor thoroughly. He found nothing out of place until he reached the hallway outside the nursery, a long corridor lined with portraits of the Elcott family. Only this time, one portrait was missing. The dust pattern remained on the wall, a perfect outline where the frame once hung. On the ground below it, a smear of something dark. He followed the trail. It led to the attic door, which now hung open, though he was certain he had never once touched it. Lantern in hand, he ascended. In the attic, the room was wider than expected, with slanted beams and a floor layered in dust. Strange items were tucked away here. A cracked mirror with no reflection, old baby shoes arranged in a circle, and a leather-bound Bible with every single page torn out, except the last. It was handwritten. I begged the midwife to take her into the woods to let the earth reclaim what it had never asked for, but Thomas refused, said she was ours, said we would raise her in love. But Clara is not of this world. I hear her speak when she's alone, in a voice too old for her years. She remembers things that never happened. She draws symbols we never taught her. And now the house listens to her more than it does to us. We are no longer its masters. The page was signed, Clara Elcott. As Jonathan lowered the book, something moved behind him. He turned. At the far end of the attic, in the flickering lantern light, stood the missing portrait. It had been nailed to the wall, but the face in the painting had changed. It now showed Jonathan, his clothes, his face, his eyes, but sewn shut at the mouth. October 4th, 1812. Late morning. Jonathan stumbled back from the portrait, heart pounding. He hadn't sat for a painting in years, yet the image on the canvas was undeniably him, mouth sewn shut with thick black thread. The brushwork was aged, the canvas cracked and yellowed with time, but the face was recent. Too recent. He pulled it from the wall and turned it over. On the back, written in red chalk, was a phrase, "She chooses who stays." Back in the study, Jonathan placed the portrait in the hallway, face down, and returned to the study in an attempt to ground himself. The journal now had entries he didn't remember writing. One read, "She walks at night. She has learned your name. The mirror has memory now." Another simply said, "The house likes you." He dropped the journal. It landed open to a page torn from its binding, yet again in handwriting not his own. "To leave, you must know her name 3 times. Speak it in the house, in the mirror, and in the earth. If she hears you first, you stay. If the house answers, you're hers." A sudden ringing. The old bell above the front door rang. Clang, 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 3 times. No one ever visited. He hadn't told anyone where he was staying. Still, Jonathan stepped to the window beside the door and peered through the warped glass. There was no one there. But in the dirt outside, something had been written with a stick or a finger. Clara, Clara, Clara. He rushed outside. The air was colder than it should have been. The fog clung tighter. But when he knelt to inspect the writing in the soil, it was gone, erased. In its place, as if burned into the earth itself, was a single word, liar. And then he felt it. A small hand slipping into his, cold, gentle. He looked down, nothing there, but the grip did not let go. October 4th afternoon. Jonathan ran back inside, heart slamming against his ribs. He locked the door behind him, though he was certain a lock meant nothing anymore. The feeling of that small, invisible hand still lingered, not a memory, but a presence, as if something had entered with him, as if it now lived in his skin. Back in the study, the portrait of himself was gone. Only the nail remained, embedded in the wall. The library. Desperate for answers, Jonathan rummaged through the house's private library, searching for local records, family journals, parish documents, anything about the Elcotts. He discovered a thin ledger bound in brown leather. On the spine, Clara's birth. Inside were no medical records, only odd notations. Born on the night of the red moon. No breath, no heartbeat. Returned after sunrise. No cry, just a smile. Eyes do not reflect light. Then, beneath those entries, the handwriting shifted, smaller, less controlled. A child's hand, scrawled across the page repeatedly. I remember being cold. I remember being in the ground. I remember the worms. Jonathan slammed the book shut. Later, the mirror returns. That evening, as he stepped into the dining room, he stopped cold. The mirror, the same one from the cellar, was mounted above the fireplace once again. He had covered it, left it, buried it under a cloth. But now it was back, uncovered, staring. He approached cautiously. His reflection stood still, too still. Then, it blinked first. Jonathan jumped back. The mirror's surface rippled slightly, like disturbed water. And in that moment, another figure appeared beside his reflection. A little girl, barefoot, her dress tattered, her head slowly turning toward him. But the real room behind him was empty. He turned quickly. Still empty. When he looked back at the mirror, she was gone. But his reflection had changed again. His eyes were sewn shut now, too. October 4th, 1812. Dusk. Jonathan smashed the mirror. The glass shattered like ice, pieces flying across the floor, some cutting his hands. But when he looked down at the shards, they still reflected his face, blinking, watching, even though the mirror was broken. Each fragment now held a different version of him, some aged, some with mouths sealed, others with something moving just behind his shoulder. He swept them into the fireplace and tried to burn them. They wouldn't melt. Later that night, the house had begun to shift. Rooms he had already explored looked slightly altered. Furniture moved on its own. The hallways felt longer, and there was always the sound of faint breathing, never from the same direction. He returned to the nursery. The drawings on the walls were no longer childish. They had become realistic, graphic, disturbing. One showed him, standing in front of the house, while something long and dark stretched up from behind, gripping him by the neck. Another was a detailed sketch of the cellar, but now the cradle held something wrapped in linen, with eyes drawn beneath the folds, wide open, and scrawled across every corner of the room, over and over again, were the same words. She remembers the dirt. She remembers the dark. She wants out. The hidden room. In desperation, Jonathan searched the floorboards again and noticed a seam he hadn't seen before, beneath the nursery rug. He pulled it up. Beneath was a trapdoor nailed shut. The nails looked old, and also new, as if someone kept trying to seal it again and again. He pried it open and descended into what appeared to be a second cellar, different from the one he had already found. Here the walls were covered in mirrors, hundreds of them, some cracked, some warped, others clean and polished, but none of them showed his reflection. Instead, each one showed Clara. In each mirror, she grew slightly older. Some showed her at age 5, others at 12. In one, she was a grown woman standing still, wearing Jonathan's coat. And then all of the mirror versions turned to look at him at the same time, and they all whispered, "You are the house now." October 5th. Midnight. Jonathan stumbled back from the wall of mirrors, his breath shallow and rapid. The reflections remained frozen, Clara in every form, eyes trained on him, even though his body no longer cast any reflection at all. A strange pressure filled the room, like the air itself was being pulled through an unseen throat. Suddenly, the candle in his hand extinguished. Complete darkness, but not silence. Somewhere to his left, a soft dragging sound. To his right, a whisper in a voice he didn't recognize. "You took her name. You owe her your face." He backed toward the stairs, reaching blindly, brushing against cold stone until he found the trapdoor and forced it open. He climbed into the nursery and slammed it shut, only to find himself not in the nursery. The house has changed. He stood now in a hallway he had never seen before, lined with doors on either side. The wallpaper was peeling, the air thick with dust and decay. At the far end, a door creaked open by itself, revealing nothing but blackness inside. Jonathan's lantern sparked back to life on its own. He moved toward the only open door, lantern trembling in his grasp. As he stepped through, the door slammed shut behind him. Inside the room was round, stone-walled, windowless. In the center stood a wooden chair, and upon it a doll, wearing a black funeral dress, its eyes mismatched, one missing entirely. Pinned to the doll's chest was a folded note sealed with wax. He opened it with shaking hands. "You are her now. The house must always have one. The last one burned. The one before drowned. You right." As Jonathan read the final line, the doll's mouth opened slightly, and a low voice, not mechanical, not human, escaped. "Tell the story right, or stay forever." The choice. The room faded. Walls dissolved into black fog, and from it came the nursery, now warped and wrong. The rocking chair moved violently. The cradle levitated 2 inches above the floor. Paintings bled. The house was no longer hiding its hunger, and Jonathan, now holding a quill instead of a lantern, realized what the house wanted. Not just a witness, a storyteller, a vessel, a new memory. The ink in the quill, blood, still warm. October 5th, just before dawn, Jonathan stood paralyzed in the nightmare version of the nursery. His hand clutched the feathered quill, trembling as he stared down at the open journal that had appeared on the rocking chair. Every page was blank, waiting. The cradle floated behind him, swaying to a rhythm that wasn't audible but felt, like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. He dipped the quill in the inkwell beside the journal. The moment he touched pen to page, a scream echoed through the house. Not human, not even animal. Something older, hungrier. Still, he wrote, "My name is Jonathan Harrow. I came here to uncover the truth. I was a man of logic, but now I am part of the house. It writes through me. She watches through me." The ink began to move on its own, continuing his sentence, letters curling like vines. "And when she finishes her story, she will wear my skin." Elsewhere in the house, he tore the page out and threw it into the fire. The flames turned blue, then extinguished. He heard laughter, a girl's. But now it was layered, multiple voices, young and old, laughing in unison, circling him. He turned in every direction, the walls shimmered like heat waves. Then, all fell quiet. Until he heard the piano. The music room. Jonathan followed the sound down a long corridor, arriving at a door that had previously been sealed shut. It was wide open now, revealing a grand piano coated in dust. Except for the keys, which were pristine. They moved on their own, playing a lullaby, the same melody from the music box in the nursery. Seated at the piano was a woman in black, back turned, long hair cascading over her shoulders. He called out. No response. He stepped closer. "Excuse me?" The music stopped. The woman's head turned a full 180 degrees, slow and cracking, revealing a stitched mouth and lidless eyes. Then she stood and charged him, moving not with feet but gliding, across the floor, screaming through her sewn mouth. Jonathan fled, slamming the music room door behind him, but the sound continued, from inside his ears. The melody wouldn't stop. He dropped to his knees as blood began to trickle from one nostril. Then a child's voice whispered from the ceiling above him, "You're almost ready." October 5th. Early morning. Jonathan awoke on the floor of the hallway. He didn't remember collapsing. His ears still rang with the phantom melody. Blood had dried along his upper lip. The candles in the corridor had burned out, yet the house remained faintly illuminated, as if it had begun glowing from within, like a living organism with light beneath its skin. And then he noticed, all the doors in the house were now open, every single one. Rooms he had never entered now beckoned with quiet darkness. The mirror room, again, Compelled, Jonathan returned to the hidden mirror chamber beneath the nursery. This time the mirrors showed not Clara but him, at different points in his life. Age 10, standing at his mother's grave. Age 27, beside his late wife's hospital bed. Age 35, seated at a desk, writing alone. And in every reflection, Clara stood just behind him, her stitched mouth slowly unraveling, thread by thread, smiling wider each time. One mirror cracked as she whispered, "You're almost hollow now." The forgotten wing. Down a corridor behind the dining room, Jonathan discovered a passage that hadn't been there before. It opened into a small wing, untouched by time. No dust, no decay. Inside, he found a pristine nursery, but one that hadn't been aged by the century. Everything was fresh, sheets folded, toys neatly arranged. A candle burned softly on a dresser. Then he noticed it. On the wall, a name carved into the plaster, over and over again, Clara Elcott. Next to it, a small mirror sat on the floor. He bent to pick it up. When he looked into it, he saw Clara's face wearing his eyes. Then her voice came from behind him, gentle, soft, chilling. "Now say my name, where it matters most." The house responds. The walls shuddered, lightly at first, then stronger. Floorboards groaned, candles blew out one by one. Then the house spoke. A deep, groaning sound, not like wood or saint, but like lungs, breathing. And within that exhale, a voice, low and ancient, "Name her, Jonathan. Bind her, or become her." October 5th, mid-morning, Jonathan gripped the small mirror tightly, its edges cold like iron pulled from a grave. Clara's voice echoed again, not from a direction, but from every surface around him. "Say it where the house listens. Say it where I was born." He understood. The cellar, the original one, where he'd first seen her in the mirror, where the cradle sat, empty, but never still. Descent into the cradle room. He returned to the hidden stairwell behind the wardrobe and descended with slow, deliberate steps. The air grew colder with each turn, the scent of soil and burnt lavender rising to meet him. As he reached the chamber once more, the cradle had moved. It now sat directly in the center of the room, beneath a shaft of light that had no source. And inside, a bundle. This time, not empty. Something lay swaddled tightly in pale fabric, rising and falling as if breathing. Jonathan crept closer, every nerve in his spine warning him not to. He unwrapped the cloth one fold at a time. Inside was a porcelain doll's head, mouth sealed with rusted wire, its eyes opened wide and alive, tracking him. On its forehead, burned into the ceramic, C.E. "Say it," the house breathed. He looked up to the stone walls and remembered the instructions from the journal. Say her name in the house, in the mirror, and in the earth. First name, binding. Jonathan placed the mirror beside the cradle and knelt. His voice shook as he spoke. Clara Elcott. A wind blew through the sealed chamber. The lantern snuffed out, and the cradle creaked. A soft giggle echoed behind him. Then the mirror began to fracture slowly, spiderweb cracks blooming from the center outward. In its reflection, he saw himself, and Clara standing behind him, her mouth no longer stitched. She whispered into his ear, "2 more, Jonathan. 2 more, and I'm free. Or you're mine." Back upstairs, as Jonathan emerged in the cellar, the furniture of the house had shifted again. Portraits bled, walls wept sap, the grandfather clock ticked backward, and on the ceiling above the staircase, his name had appeared, spelled in scorched letters, Jonathan Elcott. October 5th, early afternoon. Jonathan stood frozen at the base of the staircase, staring up at the burned name above him, Jonathan Elcott. It wasn't just carved, it belonged there, as if it had always been part of the house, waiting for his arrival, waiting to claim him. The house tightens. Every floorboard groaned now under its own weight. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a creature, exhaling around him, shifting, thinking, and watching. He clutched his journal tightly and whispered aloud, trying to remain grounded. One name spoken, two remain. But he was no longer sure if he was speaking to himself or trying to convince the house that he still had control. The mirror binding. The second naming had to be in the mirror. He approached the parlor, where he had destroyed the original mirror days before. Yet now, in its place, stood a tall, full-length mirror that hadn't been there before. Ornate, Victorian, its surface flawless, too flawless, not dusty, not cracked. Waiting. Jonathan stared into it. His reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. The eyes blinked out of sync, and the smile it wore didn't belong to him. Still, he gathered his breath and said the name, Clara Elcott. The mirror didn't shatter. It absorbed the name. His reflection smiled wider. The skin beneath its left eye tore slightly, like fabric. Suddenly the mirror rippled, and the reflection began to mimic Clara's movements. Head tilt, wide eyes, stitched grin slowly unraveling. The mirror whispered, "Say it one more time," in the dirt, where she waited. Then it bled, a single streak of dark red running down the glass from where his reflection's eye had once been. The earth binding, the final one awaits. He remembered what the journal said, say her name in the earth. But what earth? Not the cellar, not the garden. Then he remembered the birth record. Born on the night of the red moon, buried at sunrise. The Elcotts had buried her first. That meant there was a grave somewhere on the estate. He had to find it. Outside, the fog returns. He stepped into the yard as the fog thickened again, curling around the hedges, swallowing the trees. And in the center of the overgrown lawn, he saw an old willow tree, gnarled and cracked. At its base, the ground was uneven, like something had been disturbed long ago. He knelt and began to dig with his hands. The soil came away easily, almost too easily. Then his nails scraped wood, a box, small, child-sized. He opened it. Inside, a skeleton wrapped in a rotted blanket, its skull barely formed, and clasped in its jaw, a ring, his own, but he had never taken it off. October 5th, dusk. Jonathan stumbled backward from the shallow grave, his ring still gripped tightly in the infant skeleton's jaw. He looked down at his own hand. The ring was gone. Had it ever been there? A gust of wind curled through the trees, and from the shadows of the yard, that same familiar voice, Clara's voice, echoed low and distant. "Say it now, or the ground will keep you too." He knelt once more, staring into the open box. The third and final naming had to be here. With trembling breath he whispered, "Clara Elcott." The earth reacts. The moment the name left his lips, the sky changed. Clouds above twisted unnaturally, forming a perfect spiral above the house. The willow tree moaned, its branches creaking like ribs cracking open. And from the earth itself, a scream burst upward, a violent shriek not from lungs, but from deep beneath the soil. Then silence, not peace, a pause, and slowly, the grave closed itself, the dirt rolling in unnaturally smooth, as though it had always been untouched. The box had vanished. The ring was back on his hand, but it felt hot. Inside the house, something has changed. As Jonathan entered the house again, everything appeared as it had on the first day. No blood on the walls, no broken mirrors. The cradle empty. The furniture unmoved. No child's drawings on the nursery walls. It was as if none of it had ever happened, except one thing. The journal on the writing desk now had a different name engraved in gold on its cover. Clara Elcott. He opened it. Inside was a single fresh page, written in his own hand, though he hadn't touched the pen. She has 3 names now. The house is quiet, but the silence is borrowed. When it stirs again, it will ask for another. At the bottom of the page, one last sentence appeared, letter by letter, as if written by an unseen hand. Until then, keep the story alive. October 6th. Early morning, Jonathan sat at the writing desk in eerie stillness. The house was calm, not peaceful, not safe, just calm. The kind of silence that animals know to fear, the quiet before a predator moves. His eyes fixed on the last sentence in the journal. Until then, keep the story alive. What did it mean? Was the house truly satisfied? Or was he the story now, the one being kept alive until it needed to be rewritten? A return to the village. Jonathan packed a small satchel and made his way down the muddy road, unsure whether the house would even let him leave. To his surprise, the gates of Wicker Hollow were open, the fog had lifted, and the birds had returned. But the villagers did not rejoice. They watched him as he passed, silent, guarded, fearful. The old tavern woman met him at the edge of the square. She did not greet him. Instead, she simply asked, "Did she speak to you?" Jonathan nodded once. The woman sighed. "Then she'll use your voice next." Before he could respond, she turned and shuffled away, muttering a prayer he did not understand. Back at the inn, Jonathan stayed in the village that night. He dared not sleep. He placed the journal on the desk in the corner of his room and tried to write, to make sense of the madness, to put it into rational words. But the moment he touched pen to paper, he blacked out. The dream that wasn't a dream. He awoke in darkness, not in the inn, back in the house, in the study. The fire was roaring, the room untouched by time. In the mirror above the mantel, his own reflection, tied to the writing desk with rope, mouth stitched shut. Clara stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder. Her face had changed, older now, her mouth fully open, but she did not scream. She whispered, "The house doesn't want to be forgotten. Tell them all." He woke again, for real. This time, Jonathan jerked upright in bed, back at the inn. Drenched in sweat, the journal sat on the nightstand. Only now, it had begun to write on its own. The pen scratched across the page in perfect script. Section 1. The Man Who Thought He Was Alone. October 7th noon. The ink continued to bleed across the journal's pages without pause. Jonathan watched in helpless silence as his story wrote itself. Not a memory, not a journal entry, but a manuscript, a full narrative of everything that had happened. Every scream, every mirror, every whispered name. Section 2. The Mirror That Lied. Section 3. She Smiled First. It even predicted moments he hadn't yet experienced, descriptions of things yet to come. He slammed the journal shut, but it kept writing, the pages flipping open on their own. Desperation for truth. He returned to the village records office, small, crumbling, and ignored by most. The clerk didn't make eye contact, but Jonathan was persistent. "I need every burial record for the Elcott family." The man handed him a single sheet. Only 2 names were listed. Thomas Elcott, died 1783. Caroline Elcott, died 1783. That was it. No Clara. No child listed at all. Jonathan frowned. "She's not here." The clerk whispered, not looking up. "She was never born on paper, only in the dirt." Back to the tree, he returned to the willow that night. No fog, no sound, just the strange stillness again. The grave had not reopened, but something new now sat at the base of the tree. A small box, old wood, no lock. Inside, a black ribbon, still damp, a broken music box key, and a page torn from his own journal, one he hadn't written yet. On it, Section 25, where the writer ends. His hands began to tremble. He hadn't decided how the story would end. Had he, or had she? The house whispers again. That night, as he tried to sleep in the inn, the floor beneath his bedboards pulsed. The wooden walls breathed, and in the silence before sleep took him, he heard her voice again, clearer now, older, with the weight of centuries. Write it true, or I write you in. October 8th, nightfall. The village clock struck midnight. Jonathan didn't remember falling asleep, but when his eyes opened, he was no longer in the inn. He was back in the manor, seated at the desk, hands trembling, quill in his fingers. The journal lay open before him, blank. The house was completely silent, unnaturally so. Even the fireplace was frozen, its flames unmoving, suspended like a painted illusion. Then, the whisper, "Write, or I do." A familiar sound returns. From above came the slow, steady creak of the rocking chair in the nursery. 1, 2, 3. Jonathan stood, unsure if he moved by will or force. His feet took him toward the stairs. The house had shifted again. Every portrait on the walls now bore his face, stitched and hollow-eyed. The carpet beneath his feet felt soft and wet, like walking on moss. He reached the nursery door. It opened for him. Inside the nursery, there the cradle now held a book, bound in skin-colored leather. Its title, Clara Elcott, written by Jonathan Harrow. He stepped closer, heart pounding. As he opened the cover, blood began to seep through the pages, soaking the words. His hands too were bleeding, but not from wounds. The blood was coming from his fingernails, leaking slowly, continuously, as though the ink for her story had always been his body. A final command. On the last page of the book, a sentence appeared, scratched in with no ink at all, just grooves burned into the paper. "You've written me into your world, now I write myself into yours." Then, a sound behind him. Not a whisper. Breathing. He turned. In the corner of the room stood Clara, older, taller, her dress now black and ash-stained. But her face was his. Not a child's. His. "Thank you," she said in his exact voice. "Now, I get to live." Jonathan tried to scream, but his voice was gone. His lips were sealed. The room went dark. October 9th, unknown time. Jonathan awoke in the nursery, but something was wrong. He could feel his limbs, but they were not moving. He could see, but not blink. His thoughts were his own, yet his body felt distant, like a puppet held too tightly by invisible strings. He sat in the rocking chair facing the cradle. Only he hadn't sat down. He'd been placed. The journal now rested on his lap, open to a page he had not written. "Welcome back, Jonathan. You wrote her into memory. Now you wait, until she finishes writing you out." The mirror speaks. The nursery mirror had returned. But it didn't show him anymore. It showed Clara, older, adult, wearing his face like a mask. She now walked the village paths, calm and confident, in his coat, smiling at strangers. And the villagers? They didn't see her. They saw Jonathan. She waved. She laughed. She lived. The house begins to seal. Doors disappeared. Windows faded into wall. Only 3 rooms remained in the entire house. The study, the nursery, and the cellar. Everything else had been written out. As he tried to scream, his lips burned. A voice from inside his own skull whispered, "No stories from you now. Your ink ran dry." And in the reflection of the window, he saw Clara writing again, smiling as she scribbled into a fresh journal titled Volume 2. Then came the final horror. He looked into the cradle once more. There he lay, not as a man, but as a baby, swaddled, mouth sewn, eyes wide, and across the wall behind the cradle, a final message scrawled in dripping ink: "Every writer must return to the beginning." October 10th, nowhere and everywhere. Jonathan no longer knew how much time had passed. The house had stopped breathing. It no longer creaked or whispered. It simply waited. He remained trapped in the nursery, his body immobile, stitched to the chair by something deeper than thread, a curse written in bone. And Clara, she was free. The life she stole. In the mirror, Jonathan could still watch. She now inhabited his life, walking through town with his gait, speaking with his voice. The villagers accepted her without question. She even returned to the inn, resumed his journal, and sent letters on his behalf. They laughed with her, trusted her, feared nothing, because they didn't know. To them, Jonathan Harrow was alive and well, but he was not. He was only a reflection now, trapped in a single flickering pane of nursery glass. Then, a visitor. For the first time in days, or perhaps weeks, the nursery door creaked open. A figure stepped in, an old man, face sunken with grief, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. He set it in the cradle gently, and whispered, "Forgive me, Clara. I had no choice." It was Thomas Elcott, but he looked wrong, half real, flickering, like a memory wearing skin. Then, from the mirror, Clara's voice hissed, "He left me in the ground. Now he plants another." And the bundle in the cradle moved. History repeating. Jonathan watched in helpless horror as the baby stirred. Its eyes opened, black, depthless, and its mouth was already stitched shut. Then, above the cradle, the nursery ceiling began to write itself in blood once again. The house remembers. The house repeats. The house always wants one. The final twist. As Jonathan stared into the glass, he saw something shift behind his reflection. Another version of himself, calm, unbothered, mouth not stitched, smiling. And it spoke to him. "We're all just drafts. She's just rewriting us now, Theon." And it leaned in closer and whispered, "You weren't the first, Jonathan, and you won't be the last." October 11th. The ink runs thin. Jonathan's awareness began to stretch, beyond the house, beyond the nursery. He could feel Clara writing, not just pages, but people, events, memories, twisting the world as if it were parchment in her hands. He was no longer the author of this story. He was a character in hers, and she was nearly finished. The Library of Shadows. That night, if it was night, Jonathan awoke to find himself no longer in the nursery. He stood in a vast corridor lined with shelves, books from floor to ceiling, each with a name. Some titles he recognized: Margaret Holloway, Samuel Greaves, Abigail Wynne, and one that stopped his breath: Jonathan Harrow, Volume 1, incomplete. He reached for it. As he opened the cover, a voice rang out across the library, calm, maternal, cold. "You may read yourself, but not rewrite." Clara stood at the far end, dressed in morning black, holding Volume 2. The revelation. She walked toward him slowly, the lights above flickering with each step. "You were chosen," she said softly, "because you believe in truth, in fact, in reason." She smiled. "I needed that. A grounded soul, one not yet shaped." Jonathan tried to speak, but only air came out. She reached up and touched his cheek. "You gave me your voice when you named me 3 times. Now I give you what's left. A chapter, a room, a sentence, maybe. The truth about the house." She turned and gestured to the bookshelves. "This house isn't haunted, Jonathan. It's a library of unfinished people." Jonathan looked again. Every book had a title. Every book was bound in flesh. And each one hummed. They were alive, breathing, remembering, suffering. She spoke the ending. Clara held up Volume 2 and opened to the final page. It was blank. "This is the moment where you ask me to stop. But you won't. Because even now, you want to know how it ends." She handed him the pen. Not a quill this time. A bone. Sharpened. Wet. And whispered, Write your last words, Jonathan. October 12th, final pages. Jonathan stared at the sharpened bone in his hand, slick with something too warm to be ink. The journal before him lay open, its final page untouched. But the pressure was building. The house wanted an ending. Clara wanted a closing line. And Jonathan had nothing left but fear. He dipped the bone into the waiting inkwell, thick, black, clotted, and began to write. If anyone finds this, know that I... The words vanished the moment they touched the page. Clara's voice came behind him, now deeper, almost ancient. No truth, no warnings, only story. And only what I allow. The door appears. Suddenly, behind Clara, a door appeared in the air itself, not built from wood or stone but from script. Sentences swirling, words shaping a frame. It led to a hallway made of pages. Clara gestured toward it. You may walk it if you wish. Every soul must take their own chapter to the end. The Hall of Endings. Jonathan stepped through. On either side of the paper corridor were windows, but not to the outside world. They showed alternate versions of his life. One where he never found the Elcott house. One where he burned the journal on day one. One where Clara never existed. But something worse took her place. Each version ended in silence. Or screaming. A choice. Or the illusion of one. At the end of the corridor, two doors stood. One marked, forget. The other, finish. And from somewhere between them, the house groaned, louder than ever before. Jonathan stepped forward. He placed his hand on the knob marked finish and turned it. Inside was the study, where the journal now bore a new title, The Night Ledger. His hand began writing again, but it was not his choice. The bone in his fingers moved on its own, the words that weren't his. I was always here. I never left. Clara was never real. I made her up to justify what I did. Jonathan screamed inside. In his own mind, none of it was true. But the house didn't care. The house wasn't after truth. Only the next tale. October 13th, the final hours. The room grew colder as the words finished themselves in the journal. Jonathan's body sat still, hand clutched around the bone pen, muscles locked. His eyes didn't blink, because they weren't his anymore. In the mirror above the fireplace, he could see himself smiling. But he wasn't smiling. He wasn't moving at all. The new author. Clara stood behind him, both hands resting lightly on his shoulders. In the mirror, her reflection didn't match the room. She was now in another place entirely, a study with modern light, a desk stacked with books, a laptop glowing softly beside a leather journal titled, The Harrow Files, Volume 1. She typed as Jonathan watched helplessly and whispered, "They'll believe it's fiction." They always do, even when the house leaks between pages. Outside, the house awakens. Back in the real Wicker Hollow, if such a thing still existed, the manor groaned. The fog returned, and in the village the people looked toward the woods again, and quietly locked their doors. Because they felt it, the shift, the story restarting, the house was choosing again. One last revelation. Jonathan's head turned slowly, mechanically toward the nursery door. It had opened. Inside, the cradle was gone. In its place, a desk, a chair, and a fresh journal, sitting open to its first blank page. But this one bore a new name on the inside cover. You. The one reading. The next visitor. The next vessel. And then, the final whisper. You've heard the story. Now the house knows your name. October 14th. The house waits. The ink has dried. The house is quiet. Jonathan Harrow is gone, written into silence, his voice tucked between bloodied pages, shelved beside all the others who came before him. Clara now lives beyond paper, beyond mirror, among us, in cafes, in crosswalks, in quiet bookstores, watching as your fingers hover over a dusty journal you didn't know you wanted. Her name no longer matters, because now the house speaks your name. If you're hearing this, know that you're part of the ledger now. You've walked its halls, listened to its whispers, followed Jonathan's steps too closely, and just like him, you didn't stop when you should have. Because curiosity isn't harmless. It's the key that unlocks old doors. The final passage. Somewhere not far from here, a house stands forgotten. No listings, no owners, no windows from the outside. But if you listen closely on a still night, you might hear a lullaby, the soft creak of a cradle, the scratch of a pen, and a voice just behind your shoulder gently whispering, "Say my name 3 times, and I'll write you in next." The house on Wicker Hollow is closed, for now. But stories like this, they never end. They just wait.